In the high, lonely valley of Prosperity Gulch, the autumn air had turned sharp overnight, carrying a promise of teeth. Most folks just pulled their collars a little tighter and added another log to the fire. But on the northern slope, where the pines grew thick and the ground rose to meet the granite spine of the mountain, a lone figure worked with a quiet, unceasing urgency. This was Sarah, a woman of 30 years, known to the town mostly by the silence that followed her name. She was the widow, a title that had stuck to her more stubbornly than the mountain dust on her worn leather gloves. Beside her, always watching, was Titan, a German shepherd whose sable coat was the color of the forest floor at dusk. His amber eyes missed nothing, a silent, disciplined sentinel to his mistress's strange and solitary labor. For the past year, she had been building. Not a fine, tall house on the valley floor like the others, but a cabin dug deep into the hillside itself, its back half swallowed by the earth, its sturdy timber face looking more like the entrance to a mine than a home. The town had watched her work, hauling stone and felling trees with a strength they found unsettling in a woman so alone. At first, their curiosity was laced with pity. Now, it had soured into a kind of communal mockery. They called it the burrow, or, when they were feeling particularly clever down at Hemlock's general store, Widow's Follies. Mr. Hemlock himself, a man whose opinions were as wide as his waistline, would often lean on his counter and chuckle. Digging her own grave, that one is, he'd say to anyone who would listen. Mark my words, the first big snow will seal that thing up tighter than a drum, and we won't see her till the spring thaw. The men would laugh, their voices rough with an easy confidence born from years of predictable winters. They knew the cold, or so they thought. They understood snow. They did not understand her. Sarah heard the whispers when she came to town for salt and flour, her face impassive, Titan walking calmly at her heel. She saw the smirks and felt the stares, but she never offered a single word of explanation. Her reasons were her own, buried deeper than the foundation of her strange home, rooted in a memory of a different kind of cold, a cold that didn't just bite, but consumed. The ridicule became a kind of sport in Prosperity Gulch. Abram, a rancher with a booming voice and hands the size of smoked hams, would ride past her slope and call out, "Found any worms down there?" His companions would roar with laughter, their saddles creaking in a chorus of derision. Sarah would simply continue her work, perhaps pausing to lay a hand on Titan's head, a silent exchange of reassurance passing between them. Her focus was absolute. She wasn't just building a shelter, she was engineering a system. She had dug a deep, stone-lined cold cellar accessible from within, filled with neat rows of preserved vegetables, smoked meats, and sacks of grain. She had designed 2 ventilation shafts, cleverly hidden and protected by rock cairns, to ensure a constant, safe flow of air even if feet of snow piled up outside. Her hearth was a marvel of practical design, a massive stone structure that radiated heat efficiently, with a secondary flue that could be used for slow cooking. Every detail was a response to a question no one else was asking. Martha Hemlock, the store owner's wife and the town's primary source of social judgment, would watch Sarah from afar and shake her head. "It's the grief," she'd proclaim to her circle of friends. "It has twisted her mind. A proper woman would have moved on, found a new husband. Not gone to live in the dirt like an animal, but not everyone saw madness." The town doctor, a quiet, thoughtful man named Samuel, would sometimes walk the path that led toward Sarah's hill. He never approached her directly, but he observed the angle of her roof, designed to bear an immense weight, and noted the strategic placement of the cabin, nestled in a way that used the mountain itself as a windbreak. He saw the logic, the foresight. He saw the work of a mind that was not addled, but terrifyingly clear. He once saw her testing the heavy, reinforced door, checking its fit, her movements precise and economical. He recognized it as the discipline of someone who had learned a hard lesson and had no intention of learning it again. While the town laughed, Samuel felt a growing unease, a cold premonition that had nothing to do with the weather. He was watching a person prepare for a war, while everyone else was planning for a party. Sarah's days were governed by a rhythm of work and silence, a partnership with her dog that needed no words. When she split logs, Titan would lie nearby, head on his paws, but his ears were always active, swiveling to catch the snap of a distant twig or the cry of a hawk. When she checked her snares in the high woods, he moved ahead of her, a silent shadow testing the path. He was her early warning system, her tireless guard, her only confidant. In the evenings, as the fire crackled and threw dancing shadows across the log walls, the silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was in these quiet moments that the true source of her motivation would surface. Tucked into a small leather pouch was a single, creased photograph of a smiling man with kind eyes and a thick beard dusted with snow. Daniel. Her husband. He had been a trapper, a man who read the mountains like other men read books. He had been caught in an early blizzard 5 years prior, a storm that came out of nowhere with a ferocity that had rewritten the definition of winter in the region. He had survived 2 days in a makeshift lean-to, but the cold had taken him just hours before the rescue party found him. Before he died, he had told his rescuers everything he had done wrong. He spoke of how the wind had been the true killer, how it had stolen the heat from his fire and forced the snow into every tiny crack. He had described, in his final, ragged breaths, the kind of shelter a person would need to survive a real blizzard. A shelter that was part of the earth. A shelter with a fire that could not be defeated. A shelter that respected the power of the wind by hiding from it. Sarah was not just building a cabin. She was building the shelter Daniel had designed in his mind as he was dying. Every swing of her axe, every stone she set in place, was an act of love, a final conversation with the man she had lost. She was finishing his last story, turning his painful wisdom into a fortress of timber and stone. This wasn't a folly built from grief, it was a sanctuary built from a promise. The change came subtly at first. The vibrant blue of the mountain sky faded to a dull, milky white that seemed to press down on the valley. A profound stillness settled over the forest, the birds went silent, and even the squirrels seemed to vanish. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken threat. In town, people noticed the strange quiet but dismissed it as the calm before a typical winter storm. They'd seen it before. But Sarah knew better. Daniel had told her about this sky, this silence. He had called it the White Death's breath. Titan felt it too. The dog grew restless, pacing the length of the cabin, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the wooden floor. He would stop at the door, press his nose to the crack at the bottom, and let out a low, mournful whine. His gaze kept flicking towards the high peaks, his body coiled with a tension that mirrored the atmosphere outside. Sarah moved with renewed purpose, her actions sharp and efficient. She brought her 2 goats and a small flock of chickens into a small, fortified pen she had built adjoining the main cabin, accessible through a low interior door. She checked her firewood stores one last time, ensuring the driest logs were closest to the hearth. She secured the heavy shutters over the 2 small openings in the front wall, plunging the interior into a cozy, lamp-lit twilight. Finally, she inspected the thick wooden bar that reinforced her main door, running her hand along its smooth, solid surface. In Prosperity Gulch, the mood was still light. Abram clapped a neighbor on the back outside the general store. "Looks like we're in for a good one," he boomed. "Better get the checkers board ready." Mr. Hemlock was doing brisk business selling last-minute supplies, a wide grin on his face. But as the first flakes began to fall, not gently, but in a hard, slanting rush, Dr. Samuel stood on his porch, looking up towards the northern slope. He could no longer see Sarah's cabin through the thickening curtain of white, but he imagined her inside, warm and ready. And for the first time, he felt a sliver of fear for everyone else. The storm did not arrive, it detonated. One moment, there was falling snow. The next, the world outside was erased, replaced by a screaming, horizontal torrent of white. The wind hit the valley like a physical blow, a solid wall of force that tore at roofs and slammed into walls with the sound of 1,000 angry ghosts. In town, confidence evaporated in an instant, replaced by a primal, creeping fear. The homes of Prosperity Gulch, built to withstand ordinary winters, groaned and shuddered under the assault. The wind found every crack, every loose board, every poorly sealed frame, and forced its way inside, carrying with it a fine, biting powder of snow that coated furniture and chilled rooms in minutes. The familiar world outside their windows was gone, replaced by a churning, featureless vortex of white. Panic began its quiet work. Families huddled together, stuffing rags into cracks as the temperature inside their homes plummeted. The cheerful sounds of a town preparing for a snow day were replaced by the relentless, deafening howl of the blizzard. In stark contrast, inside the cabin on the hill, there was peace. The roar of the storm was a distant, muffled hum, the sound of a faraway beast unable to reach them. The thick earthen walls absorbed the vibration and the noise, creating a pocket of profound calm in the heart of the chaos. The stone hearth glowed with a steady, pulsing warmth that filled the single large room. Titan lay peacefully on a rug near the fire, his head resting on his paws, occasionally letting out a soft sigh of contentment. Sarah moved about the space with a calm deliberateness, ladling a thick, fragrant stew into a bowl. The lamplight cast a warm, golden hue on the log walls and the neatly organized shelves. Here, there was no fear. There was only warmth, safety, and the quiet satisfaction of being prepared. The storm could rage and scream, but it could not touch them. The widow's folly had become a fortress. By the second day, the situation in Prosperity Gulch had become dire. The blizzard had not let up for a single moment. Snow was piled in monstrous drifts that buried fences, blocked doors, and in some cases, reached the eaves of single-story homes. The relentless cold was the true enemy. It was a physical presence, seeping through the walls, making every piece of metal a block of ice and every breath a painful effort. Firewood, which had seemed so plentiful, was being consumed at an alarming rate, and the journey to the woodpile was a life-threatening expedition. The town was being strangled by the cold. The first real crisis struck at Abram's house. His youngest son, a boy of 6, had developed a hacking cough that had quickly turned into a raging fever. The house was freezing, their woodpile nearly exhausted. Abram's wife, her face pale with terror, wrapped the boy in every blanket they owned, but he continued to shiver violently. Abram knew the boy needed warmth, real, deep warmth, or he wouldn't make it. His own booming confidence was gone, replaced by the hollow, sickening dread of a helpless father. It was Martha Hemlock who first spoke the thought that was beginning to dawn on them all. Huddled in their own freezing store with her husband, she looked out at the impenetrable wall of white. "The widow," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Her cabin. It's in the ground. The wind can't get to it." The memory of their jokes, their smug laughter, now felt like a hot coal in her throat. Mr. Hemlock looked at her, his face grim. "It's a burrow," he said, but this time the word held no mockery. It held a desperate, shimmering sliver of hope. Abram, hearing the talk ripple through the few neighbors who could still communicate, made a decision. Humiliation was a small price to pay for his son's life. He would go to her. He would crawl on his hands and knees if he had to. He would beg the woman they had all ridiculed for a mercy he knew he didn't deserve. Gathering Mr. Hemlock and another man named Thomas, Abram prepared for the trek. It was less than half a mile to Sarah's Slope, a casual walk on a summer day, but in the blizzard, it was a journey across a frozen, alien planet. They wrapped their faces in wool, tied ropes around their waists to stay connected, and plunged into the maelstrom. The force of the wind knocked them back immediately. The snow was not soft powder, it was a dense, heavy mass, in some places up to their chests. Every step was a monumental effort, a battle against the suffocating weight and the blinding, disorienting whiteness. They couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of them. The world was a roaring, featureless void. Thomas stumbled and fell, disappearing completely beneath the snow. For a terrifying moment, Abram and Hemlock thought they had lost him, but the rope held taut, and they managed to haul him back to his feet, sputtering and covered in white. The cold was a physical pain, a sharp, burning agony in their lungs with every breath. Their beards and eyebrows were instantly caked in ice. Doubt began to creep in. This was suicide. They should turn back. But then Abram would see the image of his son, shivering and pale, and he would force himself to take another step, and then another. After what felt like an eternity of brutal, exhausting struggle, they saw it. At first, it was just a slight disturbance in the swirling chaos, a thin, almost impossibly steady plume of grey smoke rising from a chimney stack that barely cleared the deepening snow. It wasn't being whipped away by the wind, it was rising in a calm, straight line, a beacon of impossible tranquility in the heart of the tempest. Hope surged through them, giving them a final burst of strength. They stumbled and crawled the last 100 yards, their bodies screaming in protest, until they collapsed against a solid wall of wood. It was her door, almost completely buried in a drift. With hands that were numb and clumsy, Abram banged his fist against the timber, the sound swallowed by the storm, his plea a desperate, silent prayer for salvation. The heavy bar inside slid back with a solid thud, and the door swung inward. The three men fell into the cabin, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of snow and exhaustion. They were met not with cold or darkness, but with a wave of dense, enveloping warmth and the rich smell of stew and baking bread. It was so jarring, so completely at odds with the frozen hell they had just endured, that for a moment, they could only lie there, gasping. Sarah stood over them, a lantern held high in one hand, her expression calm and unreadable. Titan stood at her side, a low, protective rumble in his chest, but his tail gave a slight, hesitant wag. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his head, and the growling stopped. The men looked up at her, their faces raw from the wind, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and shame. The interior of the cabin was a vision of safety. The fire in the hearth burned with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Blankets were folded neatly on a cot. Shelves were laden with supplies. It was not a burrow, it was a sanctuary. Abram, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper, was the first to speak. "Please," he choked out, the word catching in his throat. "My boy is sick. My family. Everyone. We're freezing. We have no more wood." He looked her directly in the eye, all the arrogance and mockery stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate plea. "We were wrong. We were fools." Sarah looked down at the three broken men, and in her eyes, there was no triumph, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet, steady compassion. She simply nodded. "Bring them here," she said, her voice even and clear. "Go back, follow your tracks before they disappear. Bring your families. As many as can make it." As Hemlock struggled to his feet to warm himself by the fire, his eyes fell upon a small, worn photograph propped on the mantel. He squinted, wiping the ice from his eyebrows. He recognized the smiling face. That's Daniel," he breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. He was lost. In the White Creek blizzard. 5 years ago. Sarah turned from the pot she was stirring and looked at the photograph, her expression softening. "He told me this storm was coming," she said softly. "He taught me everything I needed to know. He said the wind was the real enemy. This place. I built it for him. The way he told me it should be." The room fell silent, save for the crackling fire. In that moment, the men finally understood. This wasn't madness. It was a memorial. Fueled by warm broth and a profound, burning sense of purpose, Abram, Hemlock, and Thomas made the perilous journey back to the town. The trip was no less difficult, but now they moved with the certainty of a known destination, a safe harbor waiting for them. They became a lifeline, guiding their freezing, terrified families through the blinding snow. The first to arrive at Sarah's cabin were Abram's wife and children, the sick boy wrapped in a cocoon of blankets. Sarah took the child without a word, her touch gentle and sure, and settled him on a soft bed of furs near the hearth, the radiating warmth from the stones immediately beginning its healing work. Soon, more followed. The Hemlocks, Thomas's family, and then others they had managed to gather. The cabin, once a symbol of lonely eccentricity, transformed into a crowded, humming ark of survival. It was filled with the quiet sounds of shivering children, the hushed whispers of grateful parents, and the steady, reassuring presence of the fire. Sarah moved through the space with an effortless grace, dispensing blankets, bowls of hot stew, and calm reassurance. She was no longer the strange widow on the hill, she was their provider, their protector. Martha Hemlock, her face streaked with tears of relief and shame, found Sarah tending to Abram's son, placing a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. "We called it a folly," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "We laughed at you. We were the fools." Sarah looked up from the boy, whose breathing was already becoming less labored in the consistent warmth. She met Martha's gaze, and her eyes held no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding. "We're neighbors," she replied simply. That's all that matters now. The words hung in the warm air, a quiet absolution. In the heart of that storm, huddled together in the shelter built from love and loss, the community of Prosperity Gulch was not just surviving, it was being reborn, stripped of its pride and rebuilt on a foundation of shared vulnerability and profound, humbling gratitude. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, a relentless siege against the valley. But inside the hillside cabin, a new, temporary society had formed. The men took turns ensuring the ventilation shafts remained clear, a task Sarah had shown them, while the women helped care for the children and ration the food. The very people who had once mocked her work now studied her systems with a reverent curiosity, understanding at last the genius behind every carefully placed stone and every well-seasoned log. The social order of Prosperity Gulch had been inverted. Abram, once the loudest of the scoffers, was now the quietest and most diligent of helpers. He followed Sarah's instructions with the humble obedience of a student, his respect for her absolute and unspoken. Dr. Samuel eventually made it to the cabin, guided by the others, bringing his medical bag. He checked on Abram's son, who was now sleeping peacefully, his fever broken. He looked at Sarah, a deep admiration in his eyes. "You saved them," he said, his voice low. "You saved all of them." Sarah merely shook her head. "Daniel did," she corrected gently. "I just listened." When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 5th day, the silence that descended was as shocking as the initial roar of the wind. A brilliant, painful sunlight streamed through the cleared ventilation shafts, illuminating a world transformed. The people emerged from the cabin one by one, blinking into a landscape of impossible white. The snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts, covering everything they knew. Their town was gone, buried under a deep, silent blanket. But they were alive. Every single person who had made it to the cabin had survived. As the slow, arduous process of digging out began, the name of the place on the hill changed forever. No one ever called it Widow's Folly again. To the people of Prosperity Gulch, it was now simply the sanctuary. The men of the town, led by Abram, made it their first priority to help Sarah, replenishing her firewood, restocking her pantry, and making sure her home was secure, their actions a silent, ongoing apology. Sarah stood in her doorway, Titan at her side, watching the valley begin to stir with the slow, hard work of rebuilding. She was no longer an outsider. The silence that had once isolated her now felt like strength. The grief that had fueled her was now a source of life for her entire community. She had built a shelter from a painful memory, and in doing so, had given her neighbors a future. The great blizzard had taken much from Prosperity Gulch, but it had given them something far more valuable in return, the wisdom to see that sometimes, the greatest strength is not in the loudest voice, but in the quietest preparation, and the deepest compassion is often found in the hearts of those who have known the deepest sorrow.